Texas may not go undefeated in 2024, but I believe they have an advantage over every single opponent on their roster going into next season.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. New customers, join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, we are going through each game on the 2024 schedule for the Texas Longhorns football team, and I'll tell you what advantage I believe Texas has over all 12 opponents on their schedule. That's the first two segments. And then in the third segment, the state of the Texas basketball program. They got a huge top 25 win over TCU on the road this past Saturday. They have a gauntlet coming up, and they're on the bubble of teams that will or will not make the NCAA tournament. We discuss all of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So when we look at Texas going into the 2024 season, I think that they have a lot to prove, right, as a program going into next year. And some people would hear that and, say that's silly, right, because, Texas was one of the four best teams in college football last year, 11 yards away from making the national championship game. And, of course, they won their conference. So by all standards, right, Texas looks like a perennial national championship contender again, right? And that is the program that the majority of us are used to rooting for, right? A team that is competing at the highest level in college football year in and year out, right? So most people would say Texas is back right now and we don't have anything to prove, right? We've already proved that, we're a premier program in college football once again. The reason I say Texas has a lot to prove going into next year is because you're changing conferences, and the narrative is the SEC is the best conference in college football, right? And there's a lot of people that want to take that narrative a step further and say that Texas cannot compete at a high level in the SEC or can't handle the gauntlet of an SEC schedule week in and week out, right? And that our success last year was largely due to us being in a weak Big 12. So I do think that Texas needs to go out and combat the narrative that they can't compete at a high level in the SEC. I think we all know that they can, right? But there's still a lot of doubters out there that are just assuming that Texas won't be able to. I think it's important for the program to go out there and prove those naysayers wrong. And then, let a naysayer know, like they say at Alabama. And also, when you look at recruiting, right, I think recruiting is all about perception, right? In the last 3 years, Texas has been able to sell that this is a program on the rise, right, and a team that eventually will get back to competing for national championships every year. But I think if you take a step back or have a down year in your first year in the SEC, then I think the perception out there may be that, well, Texas just had a great year. It was a fluke or a flash in the pan in their last year in the Big 12, but now they're in the SEC. They're back to being a middle of the pack program, and that could affect your ability to recruit at a high level moving forward, right? So I do think Texas has a lot to prove next year in terms of being able to continue to recruit at a high level and proving the naysayers wrong, right? Or letting the naysayer know that Texas can continue to win at a high level, even in the SEC, even if they won at a high level last year in what most people consider was a down year or a weak Big 12, right? So when we're looking at every team on the schedule this year, which Texas will have to, navigate to, I guess, prove everybody wrong and, be one of the best teams in college football once again and sustain the success they had in 2023. It starts with Colorado State at home on August 31st. And even though Texas doesn't schedule FCS opponents in the non-con, they should treat Colorado State at home on August 31st like FCS opponent, right? When you look at it, the question really isn't what advantages does Texas have going into this game. It's what advantages does Texas not have, right, going into this game. When you look at its talent on every level, at every position, arguably the most talented roster in college football, the Texas Longhorns going against a team with likely no blue chip players on it, right? No 4 or 5 star players. And we know that matters a lot in college football, right? We saw Colorado State put on a hell of a show to 2 a.m. last year against Coach Prime and Dion and the Colorado Buffaloes, but this isn't Coach Prime, Dion, and the Colorado Buffaloes, right? This is the Texas Longhorns in year 4 under Steve Sarkisian. I fully expect Texas to be favored by around 25 plus points, and I think Texas certainly will cover about 25 plus points against this Colorado State team at home. And Colorado State hasn't had a winning season since 2017 when they went 7-6. So even if you looked at like the lower level of FBS schools, you still would say there's some premier programs amongst that group. Colorado State, not one of them, right? Like I said, they haven't had a winning season since 2017. I believe that Texas will win this game and win this game handily. Even if the spread is in the 20s, take Texas, they will cover. It gets a little bit tougher in week 2. Texas will travel to Ann Arbor, Michigan to face off against the Wolverines, the defending national champions. But for Texas' benefit and an advantage they have going into the game, they will not be facing off against the team that just won the national championship, right? A lot of turnover in terms of the coaching staff, a lot of turnover on the roster in terms of talent. And when you look at it, it's somewhat the opposite for Texas, right? Especially on the coaching staff. They're bringing in a lot of continuity, right? The majority of the staff is in year 3 or year 4 under Steve Sarkisian. And you've only had to replace your defensive line coach and linebacker coach this past cycle, where if you look at it at Michigan, they will be in game 2 of the Sharon Moore regime, right? They're replacing their head coach, Jim Harbaugh, who I think is one of the best head coaches at any level of football right now, right? College, NFL, XFL, CFL, wherever. I think Jim Harbaugh is the creme de la creme. They're replacing their defensive coordinator, which is huge because Michigan had the best defense in the country. And we saw it show up at the highest level in the national championship game against one of the best offenses in the country in Washington. And they will have a new offensive coordinator, right? So even if Sharon Moore continues to call plays, that's good continuity there. But you still have another big voice in the building offensively that wasn't there, or at least wasn't in that role last season. So, in terms of continuity on the coaching staff, it's not even close in terms of the advantage for Texas over Michigan. And when you look at the roster itself, Texas brings back a third-year quarterback, but not just a third-year quarterback, the co-favorite to win the Heisman going into the season in Quinn Ewers, where Michigan lost J.J. McCarthy. Texas brings back 4 offensive line starters, where Michigan brings back 0, right? I think those are 2 huge advantages for the Texas Longhorns. Michigan lost over half their starters and a ton of experience from a championship team without reloading the roster at a high level, right? You could say Texas is losing 10 NFL caliber players, but they also have a top 5 high school class and top 5 transfer class to help supplement the roster and bring in or reload the talent that they're losing to the NFL draft. So I think if you look at this game in week 2, right, this is not me saying that Texas will win this game. I still haven't picked it. This is not me saying that Michigan has no chance, right? But I have deemed this as a must-win game for the Longhorns if we are at the level that we think we are, right? If we think we're one of the best teams in college football, then we should be able to go into Michigan in week 2 and beat them with all of the turnover they're dealing with compared to all the continuity we're bringing in on our side, right? We're the most talented team on the field in week 2. We'll have the most stability on the staff in week 2, and we'll have a strong culture in place compared to a culture that may be strong or not, but it'll be in week 2 under Sharon Moore, right? And that's a huge test for a new regime in their second game against the Texas Longhorns, right? So it's going to be a tough game no matter what, but I think Texas has a few advantages over the Michigan Wolverines that should lead to them picking up a victory in one of the biggest games of the season. September 14th versus UTSA. You're back at home in DKR. And it really shouldn't matter who's on the roster against UTSA. That's a game that Texas should never lose and really should never be close. But this is not the same UTSA team that you played in 2022 that led to them being up 17-7 in week 3 before you ultimately turn things around and beat them 41-20. And, one of the best things I heard that year, that was the week after we lost by 1 point to Alabama, was don't let Alabama beat you twice, right? And maybe after, a tough emotional matchup against Alabama, Texas came out flat against UTSA and got down by 10 points, 17-7, before once again turning it around and, beating them 41-20. But one of the biggest reasons UTSA was even able to get a 10-point lead against the Texas Longhorns was they had some really good players on that roster, right? Frank Harris, who ended up being like a 6-year quarterback. He's now gone due to eligibility. They had 3 NFL level receivers. Zachary Franklin is now at Ole Miss, and Joshua Cephas and DeCorian Clark have both entered the NFL draft. And Trey Moore, who was their best defensive player, right, in his true freshman season, has transferred to the University of Texas, right? So the best players that UTSA had 2 years ago, which made them a formidable opponent, even to Texas at that point, are no longer on the roster. Texas has more talent. The game is at home. It should not be close, right? September 21st versus ULM. It just feels like all your early games are just, cakewalks outside of Michigan, right? ULM has not had a winning season since 2012, and they only have won this entire century. Just 2 different levels of football programs, with ULM virtually having no shot. That's September 21st. September 28th, finally, we get into some recognizable games, right? Some games we care about. Mississippi State will be incorporating a new head coach in Jeff Lebby with a brand new staff, right? That's on September 28th against Mississippi State. They downgraded at quarterback from Will Rogers. I think Will Rogers, one of the most underrated players in college football, right? Especially at the quarterback position, going to Blake Shapen, who I think is decent, right? But still a downgrade from Will Rogers. And Texas has had success and gone against Blake Shapen in the past, right? Texas will be at home with a significant talent advantage against Mississippi State in their first year under Jeff Lebby. And this will be the first official SEC game for Texas, which should fire them up even more. First SEC game back at home in DKR. Well, I guess you play against ULM the week before. But either way, first SEC game, like I say, Texas will be fired up for that matchup. Then you have Red River against Oklahoma. I don't think we have to worry about, their motivation or how fired up they'll be for that matchup, right? They do have the revenge factor coming off a loss to Oklahoma last year, but this is one of the biggest rivalries in sports, right? So even Oklahoma coming off a win still wants to beat you just as bad as Texas wants to avenge their loss. So Texas has the revenge factor, but I'm not sure how much it means in a game of this magnitude. But you're coming off of a home game against Mississippi State and a bye. So over that 2 weeks between the Mississippi State and Oklahoma game, you'll have plenty of rest and minimal travel between both of those games. Haven't looked at Oklahoma's schedule. I'm sure they'll have a bye as well before Texas, but that's still an advantage, right? Having a bunch of rest and really no travel outside of a 3-hour bus ride between Mississippi State and Oklahoma over the course of 2 weeks. Quinn Ewers will be making his 28th start compared to 7 starts for Jackson Arnold, assuming both of them are healthy at that point. I'm a knock on wood. So if Quinn Ewers has 4 times the experience than Jackson Arnold has, I think that's advantage Texas. Texas is returning their best offensive lineman while Oklahoma is replacing theirs. And I think one of the biggest reasons Oklahoma won last year was they were able to win the matchup in the trenches. I think Texas gets that this time around in 2024. Texas has the more talented roster overall, especially at the skill positions to me, even though both teams are really talented. I think Texas has that advantage there, and Oklahoma has a new offensive coordinator, while Texas has a ton of continuity because they've had the same offensive coordinator since 2021. So, this is a game where you just toss everything up. You go out and play football for 60 minutes, and the best team on that day wins. But Texas does have a few advantages going into the 2024 version of Red River. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we get into the Georgia game in the back half of the schedule. What advantages does Texas have on the latter part of their schedule in the 2024 season? Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Happy Super Bowl to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. FanDuel has so many ways for you to end the season with a dub or a 2 or a 3. Not only can you bet on who will win Super Bowl 58, but FanDuel also has bets for which players will score a touchdown, how many points will be scored, and so much more. New customers, join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the National Football League. All right, so now we're getting into the Georgia game, which would be the 7th game on the schedule for the Texas Longhorns, October 19th at home. And I think definitely, this is the toughest game on your schedule going into next season. And I would say, even though that Georgia didn't make the college football playoff this past year, I still think they're the premier program in college football. Right now that Nick Saban is retired, I think you have to put Kirby Smart as the best coach in college football at the moment. And I think that, if you would have put Georgia in this field of 4 teams, not sure who you would have taken out. So I guess if you just compare Georgia to the 4 teams that did make it, I think Georgia would have had a really good chance of winning their 3rd straight national championship. But of course, they didn't even get to defend it because they lost in the SEC championship game. Not saying that they got snubbed out of the college football playoff or anything. I just think if they did make it, they probably would be sitting on their 3rd straight national championship right now. And I think even though, Michigan is the defending national champions, for my money, I would think Georgia is still the best team in college football going into next season. But Texas still has some advantages in this game, right? The game is going to be at home for the Texas Longhorns in DKR, where we could fit 105,000 strong, right? And that home field advantage has been really good for Texas, right? We have not lost in DKR since the 2022 season, I believe, since we lost to TCU, right? When they had Max Duggan and were undefeated, right? So that was a long time ago, feels like forever ago, but that was the last time Texas lost a home game in DKR, right? So, hopefully that home field advantage can show up and show out in a big way against Georgia that day, right? I think in the quarterback advantage, right, even though Carson Beck is really good, and right now Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck are the two co-favorites, heading into the season to win the Heisman. I think Quinn Ewers is a little bit better. And if it comes down to who's the better quarterback in this game, I think Quinn Ewers should have that advantage. And Sark's offense did a really good job of moving the ball on Alabama the last 2 seasons. And you would expect to see a lot of the same schemes that week against Georgia under Kirby Smart, who is a direct protege of Nick Saban, right? So I think that, it's going to be a very tough game. I'm not saying Texas is going to win by any means, but I do think they have a few advantages. Quinn Ewers at the quarterback position. Sark's offense has done a really good job against these defenses that, rush with 4 and play a lot of man coverage on the back end with very talented players. And the game is at home, where Texas has not lost since the 2022 season. October 26th at Vanderbilt. Just keep it simple, right? This is an SEC game, but, we could treat it like Colorado State, ULM, or, whatever, right? Vanderbilt is just not a football school, right? This was baseball. It'd be a very good matchup. If it was basketball, it'd be an interesting matchup, but in football, not so much, right? Even in Nashville, right? The biggest concern for us is not having too much fun in Nashville before we play the game, right? Vanderbilt has 2 SEC wins since 2020. Texas will likely have 2 SEC wins by the time they play Vanderbilt this season, right? So 2 completely different levels of football programs, and Texas is past the level as a program where they should even have a competitive game with Vanderbilt, right? Maybe in the 2022 season where we went 8-5, Vanderbilt could sneak up on us and lose to us by 14. Or we saw in the 2022 season, they beat, Florida and somebody else. I can't remember who it was, but nonetheless, right? Texas should not play with their food. This game against Vanderbilt shouldn't even be close. November 9th against Florida. You're coming off your second bye week of the season in a game against Vanderbilt where starters should be able to get some rest. So, that's 2 weeks of good rest before you play Florida. The game is at home for Texas, where, like I said, they haven't lost since the 2022 season. So that should be advantage Texas there, where DKR can fit 105,000 strong. Billy Napier is on the hot seat, and Florida has just not looked good offensively or defensively in the 2 seasons he has had the job, right? They really haven't had any side of the ball to hang their hat on. I think this is a huge year with a ton of pressure on Billy Napier and this program, and pressure can either build diamonds or, burst pipes. But based on what we've seen from this Florida program over the last 2 years, I think things are going to get worse before they get better, right? And Florida's best option at quarterback may be a true freshman in DJ Lagway, right? So I think that Texas will have a huge advantage at the quarterback position, regardless of who Florida trots out there on November 9th against the Texas Longhorns. So, obviously it's a Florida. Obviously it's a SEC team with the SEC roster that, should be a tough matchup. I wouldn't say should be a tough matchup, right? It's a SEC team with the SEC roster, right? So it's obviously a game you can't just go into and say, we're going to win easily, or Texas can't go into a game and not play Texas Longhorns football and just expect to win, right? But this is also a game where I don't think Texas should be on upset alert if they're at the level that we think Texas is at. November 16th at Arkansas. This is a huge rivalry game. I know it's, more so for the older Texas fans, right? Because the younger Texas fans like me, I'm 30, haven't experienced too much of the Arkansas rivalry, even though, that was a big game, a nasty game in 2021 where Texas kind of got embarrassed. But you can kind of throw everything out the window, right? Obviously, we know Texas will be the more talented and probably better team with more to play for going into Arkansas on November 16th. But Arkansas hates Texas. They hate Texas. And it's on the road, right? And they're going to go into that game doing everything in their power to win and upset Texas, right? To make their fan base, the boosters, and everybody associated with the program really, really happy, right? So although Texas will be the better team going into that game, you can throw that all out the window when the ball gets kicked off, right? Arkansas is coming off of 7-6 and 4-8 seasons where they haven't done much to improve the roster. They've probably lost better players than they've brought in. And even though most of the players are gone, Texas will be motivated after what happened at Arkansas in 2021, right? And Texas also, I believe at this point, will be fighting for an SEC championship berth and a playoff positioning at this point in the season. So they'll have a lot more to play for than Arkansas. Like I said, that probably still won't matter. Arkansas is going to come out and play their asses off, but Texas will be the better team with more to play for. And as long as they go out and play Texas Longhorns football, they should get out of there with the win, even though it'll be a crazy environment. November 23rd versus Kentucky, you're back in DKR once again, where you did not lose, but it's also on senior night, right? And the last senior night we had, we beat Texas Tech by 50. Never underestimate, right, seniors playing in their last game at home and a team knowing that that particular group is playing their last home game together, right? I wouldn't be surprised if they go out there and smack Kentucky by 30, right? Just because it's a lot of really good players on this football team especially Quinn Ewers, right, that will know it's their last home game at DKR. Kentucky is well coached, but they don't beat the top tier of SEC teams. And I think Texas is in that top tier of SEC teams, right? Kentucky is going to beat a Tennessee. They're going to beat a South Carolina, a Texas A&M, a Vanderbilt, or an Arkansas. But they're not beating Georgia. They're not beating Alabama. And they're not going to beat Texas on November 23rd in DKR. And then the last game of the season, the regular season, probably the biggest one of all, right? Not going to be the toughest matchup on your schedule by any means. But if you lose to Texas A&M, it instantly became the biggest game on your schedule, right? So November 30th at Texas A&M, another game where you could throw everything out the window. I think Texas will be playing for everything at that point. I think Texas A&M will be playing for nothing at that point, besides possibly being bowl eligible, right? I think Texas obviously will have the better team at that point. I think Texas is obviously the better program at this point. But once again, you can throw all of that out the window, right? Because even if Texas A&M comes into this game at 0-11, they are going to give 120% effort into making sure that they try to beat the Texas Longhorns. And like I said, whereas if you lose to Texas A&M, it becomes the biggest game on your schedule. If you win, it just becomes another game, right? This is the biggest game on Texas A&M schedule no matter what, right? So it's going to be a dogfight no matter what, right? Texas A&M is bringing in a new coach and coaching staff with a ton of roster turnover, advantage Texas in terms of the continuity on the roster and the coaching staff. And although on the road in a crazy environment, we know Kyle Field is one of the craziest environments in college football, 100,000 strong. There still should be a good amount of burnt orange in the building, right? There's still going to be 20, 30,000 plus Texas fans in there, right? So even though it'll be a raucous environment, you're still going to get a lot of love from the crowd, right? So that is all 12 matchups on the Texas Longhorn schedule in 2024. And the advantages I believe Texas has over each one of their opponents going into the SEC next year. A quick word from our sponsors and the state of the basketball program. It's been a roller coaster, but things are up right now after another top 25 win this past Saturday. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. So LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier for you. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process easier and quicker. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Remember, terms and conditions do apply. All right, we're going to get out of here talking about the Texas basketball team. As I mentioned earlier, they're on a roller coaster, which is normal, right? In this Big 12 schedule, I think the Big 12 has more parity than they've ever had, especially when you've added teams like UCF, who have provided some big upsets to Texas and Kansas. BYU, who's been really good and was ranked when we played them, knocked us off at home. They were at home. Cincinnati, right, has played like a really good team. And then obviously, the University of Houston is one of the best basketball teams in college basketball. So the Big 12 is tougher than it's ever been. And I think that's why we've seen a lot of ebbs and flows in terms of the performance of this Texas basketball team. All right. They've had 5 straight games against top 25 opponents. They are now 3-2 in those games. 4-1 sounds a lot better than 3-2. So I definitely wish they would have been able to find a way to, squeeze out a really tough game against Houston, right? Because then you're looking at 4-1 in your last 5 games against ranked opponents. You could say, okay, you're probably going to slip up in one of them anyway. And that explains the BYU game on the road. 3-2, barely above 500, right? It's better than being 2-3, but, I think they could have done a little bit better over this 5-game stretch, and picking up a win against Houston probably would have gone a long way in terms of, Texas fans feeling a lot better about the basketball team over the last couple of weeks. But they were able to beat TCU 77-66 on the road. TCU was ranked as the 25th overall team on Saturday. So that's another quad 1 win for the Texas basketball team, and, gives them another push in terms of making the NCAA tournament. I'm not as worried as most people are about Texas making the tournament. They play in the Big 12, right? So the wins are weighed very heavily, and the losses don't mean as much as they would in another conference. So I don't think Texas is in too much danger of making the NCAA tournament at this point, but they're also not a lock, right? So they have to continue to play really good basketball over the next 6 or 7 games to end the regular season. They beat TCU 77-66 on the road, and what I loved about that performance was a great bounce back win from a heartbreaking loss to Houston, right? The players are seeing the same things that we're seeing. They're seeing they're on the bubble of the NCAA tournament. Maybe they felt like after losing to Houston that they were on the outside looking in, right? And, that's a loss that could have, broken them, right? And they could have, played demoralized for the rest of the season. But I thought they came out, started slow in this game, but had a lot of energy even on the road and, got a very tough victory, a quad 1 victory against a ranked team on the road after a heartbreaking loss in overtime to the Houston Cougars. Max Asmus took over down the stretch. And if you looked at the box score, you would say, oh, okay, he scored 21. That's really good. That's what you would expect from Max Asmus. But I think the way he scored the 21 makes it that much more valuable for this team, right? Scoring the last 13 points for Texas, right? A lot of clutch buckets at the end, step back threes, fall away threes, right? Tough buckets at the rim, right? To make sure that, Texas won that game and, TCU didn't sneak away make sure Texas pulled away down the stretch, I should say. So you look at the box score, you see he scored 21, but if you watch the game and watch how he scored the 21, it makes it that much more impressive. The insertion of Kendall Weaver by Rodney Terry in the starting lineup, it gives you an athletic dog that can affect the game in every facet, right? Passing the ball, knocking down shots, rebounding, but more importantly, defending their best player, right? And I think that's huge for this Texas basketball team, especially with a lot of great guard play in the Big 12, that now you have Kendall Weaver from the outset of the game guarding and harassing their best offensive player at the guard position. Dylan Mitchell has been a lot more aggressive since BYU decided not to guard him, right? Like he's taking that personally, and his 13 points and 11 rebounds were huge for Texas. I've said all along, either Dylan Mitchell, Tyrese Hunter, or somebody I'm not naming have to be the third cog in the wheel every night next to Max Asmus and Dylan Dessou. We know they're going to show up offensively, but either Dylan Mitchell or Tyrese Hunter need to come along for the ride as well for Texas to perform like one of the best teams in college basketball and at their full potential. Brock Cunningham starting to make shots. At this point, Brock Cunningham's role is to rebound, defend, and knock down open threes, right? Nothing more, but nothing less. He needs to defend, rebound, and knock down open threes. His last 2 games, 3 for 4 from the 3-point line. That's a huge boost for this Texas basketball team. And then Caden Shedrick does such a good job in his minutes giving Dylan Dessou a rest. Obviously, he's one of the best defensive centers in the country. So when you bring him in off the bench, you get really good rim protection. But I think he does a really good job of giving us offense while Dylan Dessou is on the bench as well, because when we lose Dylan Dessou, we lose a huge part of our scoring, right? So Caden Shedrick does a really good job of coming in, posting up, and, getting us some easy baskets around the rim, while also, like I said, providing all-American level defense while Dylan Dessou is on the bench. So you have 2 home games against Iowa State and West Virginia this week. I think, especially being in the Moody Center, Texas has to win both of these games, because after that you face off against Kansas, U of H again, Kansas State again, or Kansas State. I don't know if you played them already, and then Texas Tech again. So your last 4 games are really tough. So you have to win 2 games this week against Iowa State, even though they're a top 15 team, and then West Virginia. You have to hold down the fort and win in the Moody Center to make sure you make it back to the NCAA tournament and give yourselves a chance to make a run like you did last year to the Elite Eight. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every